Wagon Traiin rolled across the frontier for 8 seasons, and only 8 actors ever truly belonged to its crew. Today, 6 of them are gone. One collapsed in a Dallas hotel room mid-season. Another asked for no funeral at all. Here is what happened to every face on that wagon. Number 1. On a November afternoon in 1960, the biggest star on television walked into a Dallas hotel, sat down, and never stood up again. He had come to town for a football game at the Cotton Bowl. A massive heart attack took him within the hour, and he was 57 years old. Ward Bond played Major Seth Adams, the granite-jawed wagon master whose authority came from scars rather than swagger. For 30 years before that, Bond had been the man directors hired and audiences never named, a face in more than 200 films who almost never got to lead one. Stardom found him at 54 on this show, after a lifetime of standing just behind John Wayne, his teammate from their USC football days. The two of them had been close since 1929. Epilepsy had kept Bond out of the war, and the screen had kept him in the background until a wagon master's hat finally put him out front. He married twice and had no children. His second wife, Mary Lou, was beside him in Dallas when his heart gave out, and his will handed John Wayne the shotgun Wayne had once accidentally fired into him on a hunting trip. What happened next was strange and a little cruel. The show gave Major Adams no funeral and no farewell, only a new man in the driver's seat the following season, while the real Bond was cremated and his ashes were carried out past Newport Beach and let go into the Pacific, somewhere between the shore and Catalina Island. Major Adams commanded the trail with iron certainty. Ward Bond spent 30 years as the man nobody could name, reached the very top, and then vanished from his own show without a single word. Our second face is one of the last men standing. At 92 years old, Robert Fuller wakes each morning on a horse ranch in Gainesville, Texas, where he raises quarter horses and miniature donkeys and still fishes the Red River. Fuller joined the Wagon Traiin for its final 2 seasons as the scout Cooper Smith, a deep-voiced cowboy who shared top billing. He started out in Hollywood as a stuntman, the son of a dance instructor. His real break came on the Western series Laramie, where he was offered one role and flatly refused it, insisting he was meant to play the other man, Jess Harper. He got his way, and the gamble made him an international star, honored in Japan by the Empress and handed 5 German acting awards in a single year. Then, the Westerns died. The genre that had built him collapsed in the late 1960s, and for a while the work thinned out. A producer named Jack Webb offered him a part on a new medical show, and Fuller said no. Webb kept asking until the answer turned to yes, and Emergency made him a household face once more, a series later credited with helping launch the paramedic system across the country. His first marriage to Patricia Lyon lasted 22 years and gave him 3 children before it ended, and she died of cancer a decade later. In 2001, he married the actress Jennifer Savage, and 3 years after that, the two of them traded Los Angeles for the Texas ranch where he lives today. Cooper Smith rode in late and rode out quietly. Robert Fuller outlasted the entire Wagon Traiin, and at 92 he is still in the saddle on his own land, far from the trail that made him. Saddle, on his own land, far from the trail that made him. The third man spent his life falling off galloping horses, and it nearly killed him long before his heart did. Months before he reported to the set of The Searchers in the mid-1950s, Frank McGrath was lying in a body cast with a broken back. He showed up anyway and performed 3 separate horse falls and drags in a single stretch of work. McGrath played Charlie Wooster, the white-bearded trail cook whose fussing and chatter held the whole crew together. That comic old man was, in truth, one of the hardest men in Hollywood. Born in Missouri of Irish and Native American blood, he wanted to be a jockey, rode the Midwest rodeo circuit, and became a film stuntman at 16. For years he doubled and stood in for the Oscar winner Warner Baxter, the two of them so alike they could pass for brothers. He married a Canadian woman named Libby and stayed with her for the rest of his life. While the cameras rolled, he was the clean comic relief, yet off-camera he was the man who had broken his own body a dozen ways to make other actors look brave. Wagon Traiin ran its full 8 years, and McGrath was there for every one of them. 2 years after the final wagon rolled, in May of 1967, his heart simply stopped during a quiet stretch of film work, and he was 64. They laid him to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. Charlie Wooster made the whole train laugh. Frank McGrath spent 40 years getting hurt so strangers could be entertained, and he died of a worn-out heart barely 2 years after the laughter stopped. The next man on this trail walked away from all of it at the height of his fame to go sing on a Broadway stage. Number 4 had the most famous face on the Wagon Train, and he gave it up on purpose. With millions of fans watching him every single week, Robert Horton quit the role of Scout Flint McCullough to go star in a Broadway musical. Horton played Flint, the handsome scout who rode ahead into every danger and came back with bad news for the major. Trade reporters spent years pointing out that he never found anything as good as Flint again, and he did not seem to care. He had clashed with Ward Bond on set, reportedly over politics, and he wanted out even before Bond died. So he took the lead in a Broadway show called 110 in the Shade, recorded an album of standards, flew his own airplane, and sang in nightclubs from America to Australia. His love life ran through 3 marriages. The first 2 ended in divorce, and the second wife, the actress Barbara Ruick, went on to marry the composer John Williams before dying suddenly at 41. In 1960, Horton married Marilyn Bradley, and that union held for more than 55 years, all the way to the end. A fall in late 2015 put him into hospice, and on the 9th of March 2016, Robert Horton died of natural causes in a Los Angeles clinic at 91. He had left clear instructions about the end. There would be no funeral, and the resting place of his ashes was never made public, so the most recognizable scout on television simply slipped out of the world without a gathering. Flint McCullough always rode back to the train. Robert Horton rode away from it for good, chasing a stage and a song, and asked in the end that nobody come to say goodbye. 5th on this trail, a woman buried her own son before she ever lay down beside her husband. Jeanette Nolan and the man she married, who ran the Wagon Train on screen, outlived their boy Tim by 12 years, an actor himself who died of heart trouble at just 41. Nolan was never one of the 8 regulars, riding through 3 times as a guest, once playing the wagon master's wife on the very show her real husband led. She came up through the golden age of radio, one of its most dependable voices, before stepping in front of a camera as Lady Macbeth in Orson Welles' film. Critics savaged her, and she rebuilt a 6-decade career anyway. You have heard her even if you never saw her, because hers was one of the voices behind Norma Bates in Psycho. Her marriage to John McIntire began in 1935 and lasted 56 years, until his death. They worked together constantly, often playing husband and wife, the closest thing the Western had to a real frontier couple. When a stroke took her in 1998 at 86, her last film, The Horse Whisperer, had only just reached theaters. They carried her home to Montana. In a small cemetery in Eureka, she was laid beneath a single family stone, beside the husband she had loved for 56 years and the son they had both already buried, 3 markers in one quiet plot in a valley far from Hollywood. The wife on screen was a passing guest. Jeanette Nolan was the woman who actually spent a lifetime married to the man at the reins, and who chose to spend forever between her husband and her child. If one of these stories has already put a lump in your throat, tell me in the comments which face hit you hardest. I read every single one. Number 6 is the man who started the whole thing. When Wagon Train aired its very first episode in September of 1957, the face carrying the story belonged to no regular at all, but to a guest who had just won the Academy Award for playing a lonely butcher. Ernest Borgnine played Willie Moran, a former boxing champion and war comrade of the Major, now a staggering drunk fighting his way back towards sober. Borgnine came and went as a guest, appearing 5 times across the years, yet he opened the series and set its whole pattern in a single hour. The son of Italian immigrants, he had served 10 years in the Navy before acting, and he kept working past 90, grumbling that executives kept asking whether he was even still alive. His personal life was a parade. He married 5 times, including a union with the Broadway powerhouse Ethel Merman that lasted roughly a month and which he called the worst mistake of his life. A 5th marriage, to a beauty entrepreneur named Tova, lasted nearly 40 years and outlasted all of the others combined. In July of 2012, with his wife and children gathered around him, Borgnine died of kidney failure at 95, the oldest living winner of the Best Actor Oscar. He was cremated and given a military funeral, and his remains were placed at Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills. Willie Moran was a broken man clawing toward one more chance. Ernest Borgnine launched a hit western as a falling down drunk in episode 1, then stood up and lived gloriously for another 55 years. The face who comes next left acting entirely and ended up with a Yale doctorate and a seat near the top of a Hollywood studio. Our seventh face walked away from television and built a completely different kind of life. The orphan boy of the Wagon Train grew up to earn a doctorate from Yale, write respected histories of a French scandal, and take a chair as vice chairman of the film studio Lionsgate. Michael Burns played Barnaby West, the orphan the Wagon Train took in, a regular through the show's final seasons. Discovered at 10 years old performing a scene from a streetcar named Desire in a Beverly Hills living room, Burns was a working child actor and one of 14 finalists who tested for the Monkees in 1965. He could have chased that life. Instead, he left the cameras behind, graduated at the top of his class at UCLA, and earned his doctorate in modern European history. For 22 years, he taught at Mount Holyoke College. While on the faculty there, he married the college's own president, Elizabeth Kennan, in 1986, the single marriage of his life. The two of them retired to Kentucky in 2002 and restored a historic estate into a working thoroughbred farm, raising racehorses on land listed in the National Register. Burns is alive today at 78, still tied to the studio business and still on that Kentucky farm. His wife of nearly 4 decades, Elizabeth, died in July of 2025, leaving him a widower after a long life built far from the screen that found him as a boy. Barnaby West was a child with no family and no future. Michael Burns built a future no one could have predicted, trading a wagon for a lecture hall, a racehorse farm, and a place in the very industry that once discovered him. Number 8 was a college basketball player pulled into the movies off a sidewalk, and the studio barely knew what to do with him. Spotted on Sunset Boulevard while moving furniture to pay for school, Denny Miller was signed by MGM and cast as the first blonde Tarzan in a cheap film stitched together from old footage. The studio held him under contract for 20 months and used him for only 8 weeks of actual work. Miller played Duke Shannon, the young assistant scout who rode beside the veterans through more than 100 episodes. He had played his basketball at UCLA under the great coach John Wooden before Hollywood ever found him. After the Wagon Train, he worked steadily for 40 years across dozens of shows, yet the role millions actually remembered him for carried no name at all. For more than a decade, he was the man in the yellow rain slicker, the Gorton's fisherman, selling frozen fish from the side of a box. He lived his final years in Las Vegas with his wife Nancy, taught relaxation classes, and wrote a wry memoir about the life of a working character actor. The title came from the very question strangers kept asking him, some version of whether he used to be somebody. In January of 2014, doctors told him he had ALS. 8 months later, on the 9th of September, he died at home at 80, his wife beside him. He wanted no public service, and where his ashes went was kept private, exactly the way he wished. Duke Shannon was the bright young scout who would outride them all. Denny Miller became a frozen fish pitchman, faced a cruel disease with quiet privacy, and slipped away asking the world to leave him in peace. If these stories are landing with you, take 1 second to subscribe so the next cast of the next half-forgotten show finds its way to you too. 9th on the roster came a man who survived a slaughter that killed almost everyone around him. On a hill called Tapachao during the Battle of Saipan, a machine gun tore through Lee Marvin's body and severed the great nerve in his leg, and a sniper put another round through his foot, while most of his Marine company died in that same assault. Marvin rode through Wagon Train as a guest, a brutal and sadistic temporary wagon master who set the stage for a kinder man to arrive. That cruelty on screen came from a man who had seen the real thing up close. Named after a Confederate general he was distantly related to, Marvin enlisted at 18, served as a scout sniper across 21 Pacific landings, and spent more than a year in naval hospitals before a Purple Heart and a medical discharge sent him home. Marriage brought him headlines too. His first, to Betty Ebeling, gave him 4 children before it ended, and his second, to a childhood sweetheart named Pamela, lasted until he died. In between came a lawsuit from a former partner that invented a brand new word, palimony, and dragged through the courts for years. A heart attack took him in Tucson in August of 1987, at 63. Because of the wound he had carried since Saipan, his country buried him with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. In Section 7A, Grave 176, his stone reading simply Private First Class, United States Marine Corps. He lies there near the boxer Joe Louis and a 4-star general. On screen, he was a villain you loved to hate. Lee Marvin was a wounded Marine who outlived his whole company, and the medal he earned in that carnage is what carried him in the end to rest among soldiers. The man who rides up next stepped into a dead star's boots not once, but twice. Number 10 made a strange career out of filling dead men's shoes. When Ward Bond died mid-series, the producers handed the Wagon Traiin to John McIntire, and years later, when the star of another Western passed away, McIntire stepped into that empty chair as well. McIntire played Christopher Hale, the quieter and wiser wagon master, who led by listening rather than barking. He had grown up around Montana ranchers and never lost the pull of that high country. A radio man with a deep, dusty voice, he spent 2 years at college, then built a long career narrating and acting before the Westerns made him a familiar face. Fame never interested him much, and he said plainly that Montana was home and the place he felt most at peace. His marriage was the anchor of everything. He wed the actress Jeanette Nolan in 1935, and they stayed together 56 years, working side by side so often that audiences thought of them as a single frontier couple. Together they raised 2 children, and together they outlived their son Tim, who died at 41. Emphysema and lung cancer took McIntire in January of 1991, at 83, in a Pasadena hospital. They carried him back to the country he loved, to a small cemetery in Eureka, Montana, where he was buried beneath a family stone with the wife who would join him 7 years later and the son who had gone before them both. Christopher Hale inherited a wagon train from a man who died too soon. John McIntire spent a career stepping into other men's places, then went home to Montana to claim a place that was finally fully his own. The 11th man had to make the phone call. When Ward Bond dropped dead in that Dallas hotel, it fell to Terry Wilsoon to telephone John Wayne and tell him his closest friend was gone, and the two of them wept together on the line. Wilsoon played Bill Hawks, the steady assistant wagon master who handled the trouble the leads could not reach. A Marine in the Second World War, he came home and was chosen by Warner Brothers to train as a stuntman, doubling John Wayne off ledges and out of saddles. Bond himself asked for Wilsoon by name to join the show, and that loyalty never left him. Even as the offers dried up after the series ended, he stayed grateful, telling reporters that Hawks was his real identity with the public, the truer half of him. He married an ice skater named Mary Ann in 1948, and they raised 3 children and stayed together for the rest of his days. After Hollywood, he ran a ranch and helped run a construction firm, a working man right to the finish. His final 2 years drained the strength out of him. On the 30th of March, 1999, his wife later wrote, "He simply did not have the strength to carry on, and his heart failed while he slept in his own bed at 75. He and Mary Ann lie together now at a memorial park in Westlake Village." Bill Hawks was the dependable hand who never flinched. Terry Wilsoon doubled the toughest star in the movies, then spent his last strength on the people he loved and slipped away in his sleep, gentle to the very end. Number 12 was orphaned before she was old enough to hold on to her mother's face. When Barbara Stanwyck was 4 years old, a drunk knocked her pregnant mother off a moving streetcar, and the fall killed her. And 2 weeks after that, the girl's father walked out to join a work crew and was never seen again. Stanwyck rode through the wagon train 4 times as a guest, most memorably as a gold-hungry widow who seizes command of a doomed train. Out of that childhood, she clawed her way up to become, in 1944, the highest-paid woman in the United States. 4 times the Academy nominated her, and 4 times she lost, until they finally handed her an honorary statue near the end, and people still call her the finest actress who never won. Her first marriage to a man who reportedly beat her and once threw their adopted son into a pool ended in a bitter divorce. A second marriage to the actor Robert Taylor was the one she called the love of her life, even though it too came apart. On the 20th of January 1990, congestive heart failure and a lifetime of cigarettes ended her at 82. She had asked for no funeral, no gathering, nothing at all. So they cremated her and lifted her up in a helicopter over Lone Pine, the rugged stretch of California where she had filmed so many of her westerns, and they let her ashes fall across the desert. The widow on screen wanted gold above everything. Barbara Stanwyck wanted no grave at all, and in the end she was scattered to the wind above the very ground where she had once pretended to ride. From a Montana valley to a grave at Arlington to ashes scattered over a desert, the wagon train came to rest in places its wheels never reached.